Hello and welcome to The Pulse. In part 2 of this week's show, from Tiananmen Square to Admiralty, The Pulse talks to dissident and former leader of the 1989 student movement, Zhou Fengshuo, who came to Hong Kong to participate in the protests. First, though, as happened with Occupy movements in the United States, Canada and elsewhere, private injunctions are being used as a legal weapon against Hong Kong's protests. And as many predicted, it's likely their enforcement will come very shortly now that the APEC meeting in Beijing has ended. In the meantime, 2 new organisations have sprung up in Hong Kong to examine the causes of the political conflicts here, and they say to suggest the way forward.
人哋問我點解會有個好字喺度？因為我哋嘅目的係做好香港。
On Tuesday, Tung Chee-hwa, former Hong Kong chief executive and current vice chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Consultative Conference, launched a think tank, Our Hong Kong Foundation. Mr. Tung says the concept of a better Hong Kong focuses on solidarity and that he wants the think tank to contribute to policy-making ideas in the SAR. Although Mr. Tung says the 88 advisors in the foundation come from all walks of life, others see most of them as very familiar faces from pro-establishment bodies. One advisor drew particular attention, former Financial Secretary Anthony Leung, who resigned in July 2003 after the Department of Justice said it was considering whether to charge him over the so-called Lexusgate controversy. Although Mr. Tung describes his foundation as a private think tank, many are suggesting its real role is that of kingmaker, designed to position candidates for the next chief executive race. The day after Mr. Tung's foundation was set up, another group, Civil Society Joint Action, was also unveiled. It says it hopes to track public opinion about the umbrella movement protests and serve as a platform for discussion on political reform. One of its leading members is Joseph Wong, a former secretary for the civil service. He and 18 other members said on Wednesday that they want to objectively study public opinion about the protests and future political reforms. Meanwhile, at this week's APEC meeting in China, President Xi Jinping reiterated the view that foreign influences were at work in Hong Kong. In a joint press conference with United States President Barack Obama, Xi Jinping once again raised the spectre of foreign interference. President Obama rejected the allegations in no uncertain terms.
I was unequivocal in saying to President Xi that the United States had no involvement in fostering the protests that took place there. But I did describe for him that the United States, as a matter of foreign policy, but also a matter of our values, are going to consistently speak out on the right of people to express themselves and encouraged that the elections that take place in Hong Kong are transparent and fair and reflective of the opinions of people there.
With us in the studio are adjunct professor at the Chinese University, Willie Lam, and law professor Diva Surya from City University. Willie Lam, can I come to you first? This new think tank that Tung Chee-hwa has initiated last week, what's behind that?
Well, they style themselves as a think tank, but it's a kind of a strange kettle of fish because obviously they now have a specific political motive, and that is to elect possibly Anthony Leung to make way for his electoral campaign. I
think for the record we should say he denies that, but you're not impressed by that denial.
No, but a think tank should be relatively objective and they should be looking at long-term strategic goals for Hong Kong, for improving Hong Kong's economy, improving the opportunities for the young people and so forth, which Mr. Tung said at the beginning. But in the past 2-3 weeks, they have been mostly focusing on relatively short-term political goals. For example, getting the electoral mechanism recommended by the NBC passed biological, and also persuading the students to leave the occupation zone. So it has become actually not so much a think tank as a political action group. It is of course not a political party, but it's also fulfilled the function of orchestrating support for one or two possible candidates for 2017. The political message being that most likely Beijing is not supportive of Sima Leung having a second term, despite President Xi's apparent praise of Mr. Leung. So that's why Beijing has turned to this familiar kingmaker, Uncle Tong, to orchestrate support amongst the community. But the fact that most members of the think tank are senior members of the establishment. Indeed, some of them are members of Mr. Tong's original cabinet. So this does lend itself to criticism that they have not been inclusive enough.
And of course, it's hardly a well-kept secret that Mr. Tung is a firm supporter of the government in Beijing.
Oh, definitely.
But what we've been hearing from no less a person than Xi Jinping himself is this very hard line now towards Hong Kong. Do you think this is something that's developed, or it's just a continuum?
Well, the publication of the white paper on One Country, Two Systems, I think, has made it clear that the original high degree of autonomy, one country, two systems, as agreed upon with the British and also as laid down by the Basic Law initially, has been adulterated. Now the emphasis is on control, both political and particularly economic control. So this toing and flowing of the decision on the Shanghai-Hong Kong Stock Connect, I think, is a good example.
But what I'm trying to understand is whether this hard line is something new, or has it actually been the reality from day one?
Well, I think for the first 5-6 years after 1997, Beijing did at least observe the minimal requirements for staying away with Hong Kong affairs. Hong Kong did enjoy a fairly high degree of autonomy apart from foreign and defense issues for about 6 years. But after the dramatic 600,000 people demonstration July 1st, 2003, I think Beijing realized that they have to tighten the screw somewhat. So that's why they set up this leading coordinating group on Hong Kong, and the degree of interference has increased pretty much every year.
Now, I wonder if we could just turn the subject to something that's happening really, literally now, which are all these injunctions to clear the Occupy protesters from the streets, taken by private individuals as opposed to by the government. I mean, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah. I mean, the issue is quite complicated because both private nuisance and public nuisance have been invoked by these people, whether it's taxi driver associations or even civic center, bus drivers, minibus drivers and all this. So when we talk about public nuisance, in normal cases, it should be the Secretary for Justice, like the government should be moving and seek some kind of an injunction. But in this case, of course, that has not been the case. And I see it's a tactic adopted by the government. They would like the roads to be cleared, but they do not want to do it themselves. They will try to blame it.
Why not? I don't really understand.
Because they do not have the courage. They do not have the leadership to resolve this crisis. It's not merely about clearing the roads. It is about resolving a political crisis or a governance crisis that Hong Kong is facing. Even if you clear the streets in Hong Kong by whatever means, that will not resolve the dispute that we have at this point of time. And I think the government should come up with something to resolve this deadlock. Otherwise, merely taking off the protesters off the streets is merely delaying something.
Now, the people who are opposing the Occupy protests simply say this is an illegal act. These people have to go. The people who are supporting them say, well, you know, there's a difference between rule of law and rule by law. Well, what do they mean by that?
I mean, the crucial distinction is that when we say rule by law, it basically means that whatever the law is, the content, the substance of it, the fairness of the law is irrelevant. So let us say in the context of the China, they in reality follow rule by law, even if they say rule of law. because as long as the law is there, people should just comply with it and move on. Even if they are unhappy with it, even if the law is unjust, it is unfair and all this, so it does not really matter. On the other hand, when we talk about a more substantive version of rule of law, which I think Hong Kong follows, then you have to look at the context, and merely because the law is made by Legislative Council, or even if it is made by the NPCSC in this instance, that itself is not good enough. We have to also understand whether this is consistent with basic law, for instance. So if there is a legitimate argument, and I think there is one, that the NPCSC decision is inconsistent with basic law, so I think these protesters really have a valid argument, because the basic law talks about universal suffrage. That is the goal. So it's a constitutional goal. It's not a minor issue that we want $35 instead of $33. This is a very big issue. And because of that, and I think it is very much legal as well legitimate for them to do this. And if I could add one more point. I think we
very quickly, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's about the space of engagement. You cannot engage in LegCo. You cannot engage by going to Beijing. So where do you engage with the government? So that is the place.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you both very much. And we'll be back after the break. Welcome back. It's now been 7 weeks since the umbrella movement got underway. As we reported in last week's show, there's been interest from all over the world in what's happening here. Among those who turned up to take a look for themselves is a former mainland student leader for whom the sight of tents in a major thoroughfare is all too familiar. He's Zhou Fengshuo.
25年前，我是北京清华大学的学生。那时候我在天安门广场负责广播站。一位香港的民众非常急切地跟我交谈，表达他对于天安门广场学生的支持。我记着他说的一句话。 他说：“我在天安门广场看到了中国的希望。”那么今天你们在这里，你们是中国未来民主的希望。
After the crackdown on June 4th, 1989, the Beijing authorities placed Zhou Fengshuo fifth on the list of most wanted students. He was jailed for a year and then spent 3 years in a labor camp. In 1995, he went to the United States, where he studied business at the University of Chicago. He has remained in the US and works in the finance sector.
9月28号，催泪弹对付学生的时候，当时我真的就觉得，我说哎呀，这种在中国的土地上又发生这样的事情就是像好像89年的那个场景会再临，我觉得。 就是对于我来讲，就是在那个时候最大的心愿就是站在最前面和这些学生在一起。
Last week, Zhou came to Hong Kong, where he stayed at the Mong Kok and Admiralty protest sites. He says everything he saw struck him as valuable. Every person he saw was important.
这个是大陆的诗，这个是今天刚刚写上的。北岛的诗，就是79年到89年时代的诗，很感慨了。第一次接触这个诗的时候，当然很大的震动，就是这种理想主义的这种意念，就是在这种善恶的选择，还有要挑战权威就是有1000个反抗的人倒下了，你愿不愿意做第1001个这是非常强烈的意象。
With the umbrella movement's occupation in its 7th week, the government announced that it saw no point in further dialogue with student leaders. The students have now decided to go to Beijing in the hope of securing a meeting with the authorities. the protesters are also discussing the possibility of forcing a referendum on universal suffrage in the form of by-elections.
很多的这种社会革命，它都是一个阶段一个阶段的，有些时候可能有起伏，那都是正常的。那这个阶段呢，就是好像是两个在对峙阶段，在这个时候等待和耐心，要去能坚持下来，还是很有意义的。自由無罪，自由無罪。
He also took part in a protest to demand the release of mainlanders who've been held by Chinese authorities for supporting the umbrella movement via social media.
每个星期都有新的人被捕的消息。另外一方面，这么多人被捕，也说明这种打压并没有吓倒中国的进步力量。
Zhou is the co-founder of the humanitarian China group based in the United States. The group supports political prisoners in China. To date, more than 100 people have been held for supporting the Hong Kong protests. Among them, women and artists who were not previously politically active.
那这一直是我的一个心愿，就是我希望在香港能够为大陆被捕的这些人发出声音。中国社会这个很悲哀，就是很多时候就是这样的这种良心正气被压抑，为中国公民人民这样，他还是很有能力，也有决心，就是把这个 society 这个社會建立得好。
但民主制度確保到嘅就係佢有定期即係合理嘅 interval 產生嘅選舉啊嘛，係啦，即係譬如。
Once a student leader himself, Zhou is an admirer of the new generation of student leaders he sees here. He was particularly moved by an open letter that the students wrote to Xi Jinping.
我们很惭愧，真的，我看到你们向习近平写那个信的时候，我的眼泪下来。
不用担心这个那些事情没有问题的，因为这个背景大家都知道。
我也想，就是如果是因为 public interest， 所以去就是公民抗命，然后有一个legal consequence 要承担，其实我觉得这个东西是 just。
尽管在现在就是说看不到我们做的这个能够改变这个政权，但是呢，能够每一天的做更多就是很大的动力。
想到我马上就要离开，而在这个时候，还看不到是一个明显的可以可能大家胜利的这个曙光吧。我的心情是非常的沉重。
有的人就问说，你不能回国，好像是不是觉得很遗憾等等？其实我没有那么大的遗憾。对于我来讲，我在这里在这种就是我感觉就像我真正是我的家乡，因为这里有自由，真正的自由。我的中国就是89年的中国，而这个中国现在只存在香港，没有在中国任何的地方。
Before leaving, Zhou met with mainland students and reporters, most of whom he had previously met on Twitter.
09年那会儿去美国做交换生，5月底，然后我去三藩，然后就参加周老师当时在举办的6·4 25周年的活动，20周年的活动。
你觉得我这几年有什么变化吗？
没有变化。
好，
年轻了。
有一种可以轻松一点的感觉，因为毕竟有年轻一代上来了，尽管还不是大陆本土但是这种劲头，这种精神。
随便说点乱七八糟。
哎呀，没救。
Experiencing the protesters' conditions, their nights with only a few hours' sleep and no bathing facilities, Joe said he was happy to stand in solidarity with the people of Hong Kong.
我最喜欢的一个小说和电影就是叫《指环王》。在《指环王》里，就是有一个光明的城市，代表光明的城市，但是它就在这个一个魔鬼的疆界的边上，所以最后的决战就发生在这个城市里边。所以每一次我都想到这样的一个比喻，就是在这种黑暗之中有一个光明的城市。
And that's your lot for this week's edition of The Pulse. We'll see you at the same time, same place, next week.
Tibet!